Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy Podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, George Ramsbottom provides context for finishing the breeding season timely to facilitate compact calving next spring, while also considering the cost benefit of milking on late calvers.
At the moment, Emma-Louise, we're hearing mixed enough reports about how the breeding season is going, but this is typical for the time of year. So I'd say it's no better or no worse than other years. Many herds are reporting non-return rates to me of between 16 and 65%, which would be fairly acceptable for dairy cows. Occasionally you hear about herds having a higher than normal number of late repeats. Now, these are ones that don't cycle at 3 weeks, but come in maybe at 4 or 5 weeks bulling again. But it's not. There isn't that much of it going on. Just a little bit. You'll always hear of it occasionally happening in herds for whatever reason, I don't know. But in general, in summary, things are similar to other years.
And I guess if we put ourselves in the shoes of a farmer who, is breeding now, they're in that spring calving scenario, the target that we set out in the form of a KPI would be that compact breeding, a high submission rate, high conception rate, in order to achieve that high 6-week calving rate. And, a target of 90%. And we see, a lot of farmers hitting 80 to 90%, which is really exceptional performance. There's a high number of those cows will calve in the month of February and the first week or two of March, giving the opportunity for 280, 300-day lactations. I guess that's the target, and there's a lot of people achieving that. But I suppose, can you give us some context, George? Where are we at in terms of the national average for 6-week calving rate? And then, I suppose, as a step further from that, how is that reflected in the calving spread that you would observe on the national average dairy farm?
Unfortunately, while we have a target of 90% for 6-week calving rate, the national average, while increasing, is still running at around 65%. So we still have a long way to go. Now, we've increased the 6-week calving rate by 10% in the last decade. So it's improving from a combination of management improvements, disease reduction, and genetic improvements. But we still have a long way to go at 65%. And why we obsess with the 6-week calving rate is exactly what you said, Emma-Louise. It's to try and synchronize calving with the start of the grazing season to keep our costs of production down. Because we know that if we can calve our cows compactly, just as the grass is starting to grow, we'll get the greatest quantity of milk produced off grass, and that will keep our production costs as low as is possible. But in fact, we've a long way to go, unfortunately, yeah.
For those earlier calvers, in the spring calving scenario where you're going to dry, sometime in December, so, it's across a number of weeks, you achieve that 280 to 300 days in milk. For the later calvers, so, there are an element of April, May, June calvers in herds. Say, I suppose, on farms where you are drying in December, what are the days in milk being achieved? And can you give us, I suppose, quantify the loss in milk yield, milk solids for those particular cows?
So if we look at a February calver and talk of her producing, for example, 6,500 litres, for a cow that calves in, for example, mid-May, so 3 months later, by the 15th of December, of the 6,500 litre equivalent, she's about 20% short of that. So she'll only have produced around 5,300 litres by the middle of December. Okay, and we're already now into housing time. So if you wanted to fully milk her out to 305 day for a 305-day lactation, you're actually losing out on that cow by about 1,200 litres. And with a June calver, it's actually worse. There's about almost 1,800 litres left in her. And even the April calver that would normally produce 6,500 litres if she calved in February, by the 15th of December, and from the 15th of December until she's dried off, there's still almost 900 litres left to produce from the 15th of December. So those later calvers are really having a big impact. Unless we're prepared to milk on through the winter, we're going to forfeit a lot of milk with later calving cows. And I suppose the thinking process or targets behind all this, Emma-Louise, is to calve around 70% of the herd by the end of February, 20% of the herd by the end, more of the herd by the end of March, and the balance in early April, the last 10%. And ideally, I suppose, if we're being honest about it, that's over a 10 or 11 week calving season. So there's a big target there to set in terms of achieving compact calving. And it's a big challenge for spring calving farmers to achieve those targets.
And to talk about that loss in yield, and you've quantified it, 900 litres for the April calver, the average April calver, and up to 1,800 litres for the June calver. If you're a farmer in that scenario, can you afford to dry off those cows in December?
Well, we'd love to say that if you have only a few, say, April, May, or June calvers, that it would be nearly as economic for you to dry off the herd as it is to continue milking on. There's not that much left in it. But if you have a poor calving profile, and nationally the profile isn't that good, for example, there are 15% of the cows left to calve in April. There are 9% of the cows that in the national herd calving in May, and 3% are calving in June. So if you have a kind of a long drawn out calving pattern, it can be very difficult but to continue milking over the winter to try and recoup some of the milk yield potential that's been lost compared to a herd that's dried off abruptly around the middle of December. There's money in it, and you probably can't afford to do it in 1 year if you have a less than favourable calving pattern.
And you've alluded to grass being the driver of the seasonal spring calving system in relation to the lower cost relative to other feed sources.
Correct.
If we consider milking on into December, January, the first thing we think of is feed costs. And I guess, could you quantify that for that scenario? What is costing you to feed those animals?
Well, if we compare a February and a May calving cow producing the same amount of milk, twice as much silage will be fed, and we're talking about good quality silage now, will be fed to the May calver compared to the February calver, and 60% more meal will be fed to the May calver compared to the February calver to get the exact same milk out of her. And in monetary terms, the minimum this is going to cost is about €130 extra per May calver compared to a February calver. So you can see the impact that's been felt on just on forage and feed costs alone, not to mention the cost of turning the parlour on for the 365 days to get the bit of milk out of that cow through the winter.
And you mentioned, the parlour costs are an additional consideration. What else do we need to consider when milking on through the winter?
Yeah, so there's about 5 or 6 different areas of consideration when we're looking at whether it'll justify us or not to milk the cows through the winter. Well, the first one, obviously, a basic one, is labour availability. Who's going to be there to milk the cows twice a day, 365 days of the year, to get this milk out of them? If it's just a lone operator, one person working on their own on the farm, and say they're a married person, be it male or female, who's doing the work, well, the spouse is probably not going to be that excited about you being out of the house twice on Christmas Day, even if you go to once a day milking on Christmas Day. The second thing that'll determine whether it's worthwhile doing or not is the number of cows you're talking about. So obviously, if you have a very spread out calving pattern and a lot of April, May and June calvers, it's more worthwhile for a larger number of cows being milked through than it is for a smaller number of cows being milked through. It may not justify it, even if you have a number of May calvers, if the number is actually very small. Then the third consideration, Emma-Louise, is around cell count, somatic cell count. Invariably, cell count tends to rise over the winter. So if cell count is already, say, on the wrong side of 200,000 coming into, say, September, October, November time, almost invariably will creep upwards in a herd that's been milked across the winter and may result in penalties being incurred. So this may put a further pressure on the overwinter milking. Silage quality is another consideration. So for every 5% reduction in DMD, we're talking about a 1 kilo of extra meal being fed. So all very, very quickly, in herds of cows that are being fed on poor quality silage, the economics are going in the wrong direction straight away. And I suppose the other consideration then has to do with accommodation. So if there isn't suitable high quality housing available for the cows that are being milked indoors over the winter, well, you're going to be challenged in terms of mastitis and TBC, and keeping those sort of quality criteria down. And it may not be worthwhile trying to milk on over the winter.
And I guess, like, fundamentally, there are a lot of considerations, and by and large, we really do just think of the feed cost. You mentioned the labour aspect of things, and my argument would be the break that the farmer needs. While things do slow down at this time of year, first cut is done. The intensive part of the early breeding season is complete. There's still a lot of boxes to tick, and people are turning their attention to maybe the maintenance that they let slide over the last few months. So while things do get quieter, there's still that element of, as you say, milking twice a day and being on the farm, and the decision and management around lactating cows. How important is it for dairy farmers to take a little bit of time, and slow down the pace of their working day in kind of December, January time?
It's kind of incalculable what a break from milking, the benefits that are achieved from a break from milking. So those 30 or 40 days that the farmer has with his or her family, or just to get a physical break from the whole thing, maybe to go on a holiday or something like that, get a few days off somewhere, is you really can't put a monetary value on it. And it's amazing that after a month's break or 6 weeks break from milking over that kind of the dark days of around Christmas, it's amazing how refreshed people are and how much they're looking forward to the calving and resuming milking and back into the routine again. And it does, but I can't put a figure on it either from a mental perspective or from a financial perspective of the value of that break. It's hugely important, Emma-Louise.
And I suppose, just a side note on the, I guess, the calving season that has a lower peak. So for farmers who are in the scenario where, they're reaching 75% 6-week calving rate, there is a personal preference in some scenarios that you don't hit that 90%, and it may be deliberate on some farms. But by the same token, it is just not recommended, I guess, to have those May and June calvers in the system. You might not necessarily aim for the 90% 6-week calving rate, but I guess the length of the calving season is the other aspect. And it's just, I guess, those cows that are constantly creeping into, May and June, it's just, I guess they are a problem, and they are losing a lot of milk and money on the farm.
If you think about it, sometimes we hear stories about, are we going to be under too much pressure with a very compact calving period? But what's not considered in those situations is the benefits that are there by focusing on calving for a tight for February and March principally, and then a kind of a month's break or nearly a month's break between the end of calving and the start of breeding, just to get another little break, and you can switch from one system into the other. And the other problem you have is that where there's a drawn out calving pattern with cows calving and breeding starting, the late born calves, really farmers will struggle to breed cows and rear calves at the same time. So there is that the kind of the added benefit that's there by being able to focus on a compact calving and switching completely from calving cows, having the break, and then going to breeding. That's kind of another unquantifiable benefit that's there, and it's more than overcomes the additional pressure that's on during the calving season. It's more of a benefit than people perceive, and it's well worthwhile doing.
And let's talk about the I suppose the impact of what we're doing right now on what we're going to be doing next spring. I suppose firstly, George, can you recommend what is the standard breeding season length that you would like to see on a farm?
Yeah. So what we'd like to see on farms, and we're being ambitious here, or I'm being ambitious, is a 10 or 11 week maximum breeding maximum calving season. So an 11-week calving season will reflect itself in a 10-week breeding season. That's a tight time frame. Remember that a cow bred on the 1st of July this year, as a repeat cow probably, she won't actually calve until around the 11th of April next year. So by the time this podcast is going out, Emma-Louise, we're already talking about April calving cows. In an ideal scenario, we'd like to see our unplanned empty rate being less than 7% of the total herd. But to achieve that, we have to achieve, fairly stringent targets. Practically all of the heifers, maiden heifers submitted probably in the first 10 days, really, to give them 2 chances of being bred in the first month of the breeding season. We're talking about, submitting 90% plus of the cows in the first 3 weeks of the breeding season, and all of the cows in the first 6 weeks of the breeding season. So these are ambitious targets, but they're there for a purpose. And I suppose if people have a very drawn out calving pattern, the first step might be to consider stopping breeding towards the end of April, stopping calving towards the end of April for next year. And that means removing the bull from the herd in or around the 20th of July. And you're tightening up the tail end of your cows. That will confine calving to April. And then take 10 days off it for a couple of years until you really tighten things up. And even if you have an unfavorable calving pattern and can't afford to dry cows off completely this winter and will milk on, you're going to tighten up things, and the purchase of a small number of in-calf high quality heifers calving in February to boost up the proportion calving next February, along with your own complement of heifers, will gradually improve the situation and the calving pattern on your farm and get you back into the zone of compact calving, maximizing the amount of meal or maximizing the amount of grass in the diet, and removing the need to be feeding calves and breeding cows at the same time, calving, feeding and breeding at the same time. You're trying to tighten that up the whole time.
I think that I suppose idea that you mentioned of breeding for 10 weeks is a very interesting concept. And, in the past you would have seen, it would have been very standard to have maybe a 16-week breeding season. But given that, I suppose, I say, we're in a no quota environment, and, I guess that's not so much the case for everybody, but, people have had the freedom to let their herds express their genetic potential. And, you allude to the improvements we've observed in the last decade. And that's a result of management. Farmers are really getting on top of the fertility. You talk about the reduction in disease and also the genetics. But I think there's another interesting factor, and not to complicate it, but I think because farmers are in the situation where the majority of cows are calved at the start of April, they are able to shift their attention to completing a really good 3 to 4 week pre-breeding period of heat detection and observing cows and identifying cows with problems which can be rectified. And I actually think you could nearly, in a hidden way, add that to your breeding season. And I actually think we're displacing a prolonged breeding season with that earlier practices and earlier management on farms.
What you're finding, Emma-Louise, is you're finding that, remember this gap I talked about between the end of calving and the start of breeding? That gap is a great opportunity to kind of tighten up and clear the decks in terms of finding problem cows that need to be treated, getting in there early, getting the interventions done, and having them submitted as soon as you can into the start of the breeding season. And there's huge benefits to be achieved by doing that.
As you say, George, cows that are being bred in and around today are going to calve on the 10th of April. I suppose, a final question for you. If farmers are unsure and they're assuming cows are in calf, should they get the vet or their scanner in today, tomorrow, to scan those cows and check, are they in calf? If not, there's one last chance to give them a go.
in a scenario where we've had a high quality calving season with very compact calving and things are going well, the benefits for that probably aren't massive. Where that'll pay rewards, Emma-Louise, is in herds where there's been a drawn out calving pattern. Maybe there's a stock bull has been used, or they're not great on the records and they're not quite sure, and having a good history of achieving high levels of fertility. And in those sort of herds, there is certainly a benefit, and going on a 10-day treatment program for those anestrus cows would probably sort a lot of them out when they're confirmed not in calf. So there is a chance now, if we're only going to knock May off, or the middle of May off the calving season next year, there'll be 2 opportunities between now and around the end of July to get those cows in calf. If they're scanned now, then they're treated on a 10-day treatment regime if they need it, and then they'll have 2 chances to get them bred. So go for it.
And the final thing, George, the AI stops, or we remove the bull, and one of your best cows in inverted commas is bulling. Do you go back in with the straw?
The hard answer to that, Emma-Louise, is the farmer says to you, my best cow has just come bull, and what will I do? Well, if she's coming this late, she's not your best cow anymore. So the best you could do with her is she's 2 choices. One is a career change out of dairying, and the other is she gets a beef straw and she's putting calf to a short gestation high DBI beef bull for to breed a beef calf out of her next year. But she's not your best cow anymore, Emma-Louise.
That's great. Thank you, George.
Thanks, Emma-Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to George Ramsbottom for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.